second reading today comes from 2 Corinthians chapter 4. There's a passage that was a touchstone for John Calvin in the early Reformation. You know, he did not have an easy time. After 3 years of being there, he was kicked out of his church in Geneva, Switzerland, and yet they discovered that life had been better under that discipline. Calvin had a scripture passage that guided him and that ended up guiding the Reformation, and it was one that simply said, "Out of darkness, light." And that passage comes today from 2 Corinthians chapter 4, beginning with verse 6. Listen for the word of the Lord. "For God, who said, 'Out of darkness, light,' has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God, not to us. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our bodies. For we who live are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our mortal flesh. So death is at work in us, but life in you." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You know, there's an everyday image that sticks in my mind. It's the sort of thing you'd see anytime you're driving down the interstate. You know how you're driving along, everything's going well, and then all of a sudden the traffic seems to slow a bit and people start to make some strange moves, and you look and see there's something up ahead. What is it? And then you see it. It's a big truck with a sign that says, "Wide load." It's an iconic image for today's world. That we're all on a journey, but we have so much wide load baggage. We want it all. Big homes, big jobs, big experiences, many belongings, and 4,000 friends on Facebook. We're so busy juggling our wide load life that we don't have time for healthy relationships and to figure out what's really important in life. So we bring along an even bigger load of resentments and slights and anger at perceived past insults. And our leading indicators of success make for a wide load life in a wide load world. Paul is confronted by a bunch of wide load people in Corinth. You got a picture here of a temple in ancient Corinth. You can see how big those pillars are on that picture. But the thing is, there were a lot more pillars on that temple, and there were all sorts of big temples like that all over Corinth because they had these big gods that had to be worshiped in their wide load world. They bragged about their credentials and their clubs and their social status and the marks of their success, including what they ate and their religious practices and how they ate the right food and said the right words and did the right things. They're so successful, they, like us, had a world that worships success. They give veritable catalogs of credentials. Paul hears them all the time, how successful they are, and Paul laughs at their lists, and he says, "Okay, you want to brag? I have a list of my own credentials." And then Paul lists out this long list of his failures. One of the places where Paul was put on trial was in Corinth. Really, that is the spot where Paul was put on trial, on top of those stones there. Dragged in front of the whole community, disparaged, mocked, charged with sedition. But Paul goes on to list what his credentials are, the number of times he was put on trial, the number of times he was put in prison, beaten, flogged, given a death sentence, the number of times he was shipwrecked, floated adrift in the open sea, threatened by gangs of bandits, threatened by people in his own religion, not to mention other religions, the number of times that he was hungry and thirsty and shivering and freezing in the cold, and then at the end of his long list, he put something of an etc., as if to say he could go on a long time. Paul brags about all his failures. Why does he brag about things like being put on trial? Well, when he was put on trial, the judge ended up letting him go. Against all the odds, the failure and humiliation of being put on trial ended up giving him the opportunity to witness to his faith in a public place. His humiliation ended up giving him the microphone in which to proclaim the good news of the God of love. Later Christians carved his words in a stone, and that stone is still there, and the stone says, "For this slight momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison." See, Paul knew the truth of faith, that our failures in the grace of God can be redeemed, to strengthen us to bear the power of the wonder that we will receive. Paul laughs at other people's lists of successes because he knows they're really going to count for nothing. And he knows that his failures will be redeemed by God, and that is a power beyond all others. Paul carries his catalog of weaknesses, failures, and pain, and all that he has suffers. Who brags about such things? People of faith. And Paul calls us to look at the whole of the Bible and to think about how that is borne witness in other stories in the Bible. The Bible does not worship success. It doesn't worship that wide-load world. The Bible's full of people who fail. Moses leading people out of slavery. It should have been a 2-week trip to the Promised Land. It ended up taking 40 years. Moses couldn't be the charismatic leader who made everybody all of a sudden follow in line. No, Moses and the people themselves failed again and again and again, and it took them 40 years. They came by stages, not stages of success, but stages of failure. But through those stages, God kept showing up and leading them along the way. The only reason they reached the Promised Land was not the strength of Moses or the faithfulness of the people. The only reason they reached the Promised Land was God's faithfulness. Look again at other parts of the Bible. Look at the book of Judges, where it says time and again, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And we think, oh, that's great. Everybody did what was right in their own eyes. No, what that really means is their egos led them down the wrong path time and time and time again, and they failed. And yet the people over time prevailed because God was faithful. Take a look at the stories of the prophets who are abused and rejected, the long list of defeats and disappointments and continual failures. They fight but do not conquer. It's the glorification of failure, if anything, in the prophets, and yet this irrepressible, inscrutable hope is present there beyond all the failures. There's a passage in Isaiah chapter 49, verse 2, where the words of the prophet says, "He has made my mouth like a sharp sword, and in the shadow of his hand he has hid me. He has made me a polished shaft, and in his quiver he has concealed me." This biblical leader may be sharp, may be shiny, but is hidden in the shadow of God's quiver. It's an enclosure of failure, obscurity, bad reputation. The truth is hidden, overshrouded in failure and obscurity. And yet, out of darkness, light. God's power is made perfect through weakness. It's a very different understanding of the definition of success, that it's about God's faithfulness to us that leads us to come to understand how we live in God's love. If we think about that, and think about how, the world kind of tells us we're not supposed to have any difficulties. It's supposed to be easy. We're supposed to be successful. We're not supposed to have a hard time. And yet, the Bible is a lot more honest than the culture around us. Because life is hard and difficult and full of disappointments and failures. And the whole story of the Bible is honest enough to tell that story to the world and to say, the hope that we have is not in ourselves, it is in the grace of God. And through the grace of God, these amazing things happen. The Bible's not about the strength of Moses or the prophets or Peter or Paul. It's not about their strength at all. It is about God who works through the failures. God doesn't cause the failures. God does not make the bad things happen, but rather when that happens to us in the world, whether because of the world itself and just how things are and chance, or whether it's because of choices that we've made, God comes in the midst of the failures and tragedies of life and seeks to redeem us. The function of the hardships, as Paul understands them, is to help us to distinguish what is truly important in our lives. It does not mean that there won't be 40 years in the wilderness. There may be. But that God will be faithful to us in these unexpected times in the wilderness. And we will be redeemed, and we will be able to continue the journey towards hope. Jewish theologian Martin Buber says biblical leaders are a foreshadowing. Biblical leaders are a foreshadowing of how people live in God's light and learn from God. Dialogue is what Buber says. Dialogue in the midst of failure. And therefore, the call for us is to commit ourselves to continuing the dialogue with God, to be able to discover where God is speaking to us still. Part of us really wants to resist that dialogue. We want the easy way. We want the wide load. We want the definition of success that the world gives us. But the Bible calls us to recognize the truth about life and the truth about hope. And that is to continue in this dialogue with God to discover the surprise that God is going to give to us. Biblical life is about a process of being led through the midst of that dialogue with God. I want to read an extended quote from Martin Buber, this wonderful Jewish scholar. He says, quote, the real way from creation to the kingdom is trod not on the surface of success, but in the deep of failure. The real work, the biblical point of view, is the late recorded, the unrecorded, the anonymous work. The real work is done in the shadow, in the quiver. Official leadership fails more and more. It devolves more upon the secret. The way leads through the work that history does not write down, history cannot write down, the work which is not ascribed to him who did it, but which possibly at some time in distant generations will emerge as having being done without the name of the doer, the secret working of the secret leadership. End quote. in the midst of a wide load world. It's time to reject the wide load life, to go for the narrow path that will give life meaning, eternal meaning. Jesus gives us a different path for our journey, the path that is not about the endless struggle for success, but the path of faithfulness, of a continuing dialogue with God, reflecting with God, praying to God, listening to God in the midst of the people to discover where God is leading us out of our failures into the hope that God is handing to us. I love that passage from 2 Corinthians, that we're afflicted but not crushed, perplexed but not despairing, persecuted but not forsaken, struck down but not destroyed. The heart of the gospel is not an easy life, not endless success, not the absence of struggle and conflict, but rather this continuing divine assurance that God is with us and will lead us out of darkness, light. My power is made perfect in weakness. I'd like to tell you the story of a couple people that I knew a number of years ago who really inspired me. It's a story about Julia and her daughter. Julia was a society lady, a class act, a wonderful person, vivacious, sharp, smart, beautiful, lots of savvy, style, and grace. She had her own business, and she was very successful. And then this tragic accident happened, and her daughter ended up being blinded. Her daughter woke up afterwards in the hospital and asked her mother, "Will I ever see again?" And Julia took a breath and told her daughter, "No, you will not with your eyes, but I will be your eyes. And with God's help, we will find a way." So they began a journey. Julia had to step out of her popular, fun, busy social life. She had to drastically reconfigure her business life. And when her daughter went to college, Julia went to classes with her. In the days when they did not have books on tape, Julia dictated all her daughter's books into a recorder so her daughter could listen to them. This for all 4 years of college. And when it came time for graduation, you know, they have that ritual of humiliation when they figure out everybody's grade point average. Well, her blind daughter ended up with a perfect 4.0. Theirs is a story that is not a tribute to the power of the body. The body is weak, it's vulnerable, and bodies fail. Theirs is not a tribute to the power of the mind. These were two ordinary people. Theirs is a tribute to the weakness, to the vulnerability. The eyes failed, to the weakness and the vulnerability of someone who is willing to give up her successful life for a life of service, a life of sacrifice, a life of love. Theirs is a story of power made perfect in weakness, in vulnerability, in giving of herself. Love manifested in one who was willing to let her life go. And also the vulnerability of the daughter, who was willing to admit that she needed help. Because so many people try to be so strong, and they won't admit, "I need your help." It is a testimony of two people willing to live in that vulnerability, and God's power is made perfect in such weakness. Friends, we all have our journeys to take. Our challenge is to make sure that no wide load gets in the way of our journey in God's love. Our call is not to pretend that any one of us is perfect. None of us is. Our call is not to pretend that we have no weaknesses, no failures. We all do. but our call is to face the world and to listen to what God is teaching us in the midst of the challenges and failures that we are given, to open ourselves to following the path where God calls us. And when sacrifice is called for, when suffering love is required, to do what we can do to be faithful, even if everything is taken away. For out of darkness, light. God's power is made perfect in weakness. We see that power. That power leads us. That light leads us. The power and the light of the cross of Jesus Christ, who suffered and died and rose for us all. Amen.
Thanks for watching our video. Make sure to subscribe to get the latest and greatest videos from the Old Stone Church. And if you feel blessed by our message, please go to theoldstonechurch.org and click to donate. God bless you today and forever. The Old Stone Church. We've been loving Christ and serving City since 1820.